Welcome, everybody, to another GLC at lunch. This time on a Friday, not a Wednesday. I'm not sure that matters. And we're very pleased to have a large group in the room and growing group out online. It's a great pleasure to welcome John Marquez, who teaches at the University of California, Riverside. He's also taught at Colorado College. He did his PhD at the University of Illinois. And a BA back in California at Cal State Long Beach. He's written lots of essays and reviews. He works on the Portugal-Brazil relationship and the Atlantic world. And this is part of a book he's writing. I don't know exactly what stage of finishing. Books are always in some stage of finishing, even if they're not there yet. But it's called Freedom on Three Coasts in the South Atlantic World. John is a kind of comparative historian of the Atlantic world, and I guess Atlantic world scholars have to be comparative in some form. Ed Ruderman knows that. So, John, it's great to have you here. I think you're into your second or third week here already. Third time flies when you're having such fun.
Yes.
John, welcome, and it's over to you.
Thank you, David, and thanks for everyone for being here, and thanks everyone who's here virtually. Before I start, I want to sincerely thank the staff of the GLC for their work in organizing this talk, also for making me feel incredibly welcome and supported during my my fellowship period here over the last few weeks. I know that there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes to make these fellowships happen as seamlessly as they do, and so I want to acknowledge and recognize that labor.
That's very kind of you, especially from my colleagues.
Thank you.
I especially want to thank the staff of the Beinecke Library and the Yale Center for British Art, who have helped me track down some really incredible sources that I've been able to consult during my time here, and definitely have to come back and spend more time in those collections. And then finally, before I start, I wanted to observe that in Brazil, which is the area that is my specialty, yesterday, November 20th, was the Day of Black Consciousness. It's now a national holiday that celebrates Black history in Brazil and the contributions of African descended peoples over 500 years, more than 500 years. And so it's in the spirit of Black Consciousness Day in Brazil, day late here, but that I want to give my talk today.
Great.
And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so I can get a couple images. So just before I get into the presentation formally, I just wanted to geographically orient us a little bit to the region of the world that I'm going to be talking about, which is Brazil and South America. Here, a great image that I've been able to get from the Yale Center for British Art, from the James Forbes archives from the 1790s, shows an image of South America. And I'll be mostly talking about a city in Brazil called Salvador. And it's located in what's now the state of Bahia. And for most of the colonial period until the later half of the 18th century was the colonial capital of Brazil. And so as you see here, the image on the left shows you Brazil in red, and on the right, you'll see, I don't know if I have if my pointer works here, but you'll see the region that I'm talking about, the city that I'm talking about, Salvador, and the Bay of All Saints. So I just wanted to sort of orient us, and I have a few more maps, but at least for now, when I talk about Salvador, I'm talking about the far Brazilian Northeast. Okay. Here, another just overview shot from 1750 of Bahia, of the city of Salvador, also located in the Beinecke. I really wanted to include as many Beinecke Yale Center for British Art pictures as I could. So as you can see, this is a great place for doing research. Yeah, great place for doing research on Brazil and the Atlantic world. Okay. At the onset of the 18th century, an era marked by the stunning growth of the slave trade to Brazil, an enslaved woman in Salvador, Bahia, petitioned the Portuguese king. Identifying herself as Marcelina Dias Silvestre, she supplicated for royal grace to escape what she called her ruim cativeiro, a phrase that literally translates to bad captivity, but more closely conveys not only physical but moral injury. Years earlier, Marcelina sued her enslaver to enforce a broken manumission agreement, but she was unsuccessful in every court that she appealed to. In her petition to the king, Marcelina explained that her freedom suit resulted in violent retribution and excessive punishment from her enslaver, a woman she also described as a prostitute who forced her into the same line of work. These circumstances were compounded by the fact that Marcelina was, quote, more than 40 years old and suffering from ailments that almost always leave her bedridden, unquote. By the end of her only two-page petition, Marcelina advanced a novel argument for its time, one that would have a long-standing effect on Brazil. That argument was that for her suffering under enslavement, she was entitled to manumission. There are several reasons why Marcelina's petition matters to the history of slavery and freedom in Brazil and the Atlantic world, and which I hope to explain today. First, her petition is among the earliest surviving petitions from an enslaved person in Brazil to a Portuguese monarch in Lisbon. Though the petition does not give us her unmediated voice, it nevertheless affords historians a window into enslaved people's legal consciousness. Second, her petition made a particularly novel argument for its time, that subjection to abuse, excessive punishment, and a so-called quote-unquote bad captivity created restitutive pathways to legal freedom. Indeed, while her earlier freedom suit sought to enforce a broken manumission agreement, her petition directly to the king rested squarely on a moral condemnation of her enslavement. Here, the notion of a quote-unquote bad captivity emerged at the turn of the 18th century as a flexible framework to describe the limits of a tolerable captivity. Finally, Marcelina's petition offered other petitioners in her own time and long after a framework for critiquing enslavement and ultimately claiming freedom, particularly as it related to suffering under sexual exploitation and violence. Marcelina is a central figure in my book project that David mentioned and that I'm working on as a fellow here at the GLC. Tentatively titled Freedom on Three Coasts, Slavery, Law, and Belonging in the South Atlantic World, my book asks what I see as the deceptively simple question of what it meant to become free in a world so deeply marked by unfreedom. Focusing on Black communities in Brazil, Atlantic Africa, and Portugal between the 16th and 18th centuries, I narrate the surprisingly interconnected histories of freedom struggles as they played out in the intimate spaces of the home, at the baptismal font, in notary offices, before judges and monarchs, and on the ships that plied the corridors of the South Atlantic. The protagonists of this book are free Catholic Africans, conditionally freed mothers in Rio de Janeiro, enslaved women petitioners in Bahia, maritime maroons fleeing Brazil for Portugal's free soil, domestic workers in Luanda, Angola, and African nobles exiled to the Americas, among others. These historical figures have been largely absent from the scholarly narratives about freedom in the South Atlantic, but my book insists that they were thinkers and theorists about the changing world around them, and that their actions made freedom a countercurrent to a world founded on enslavement. The meanings of freedom in the South Atlantic world were diverse and resist simple characterizations as merely the opposite of enslavement. Societies on all three sides of the South Atlantic world were deeply hierarchical, and differences were perceived as natural aspects of social and political relations. This was true for enslaved people and freed people of African descent. In such a context, many freed peoples and communities learned that day-to-day free life was bound up in larger struggles over dependency, patient-client relationships, and mobility. For this reason, in my book, I set out to reframe the history of freedom in the South Atlantic world within the broader aspirations of Africans and their descendants to claim and reaffirm belonging to families, to communities, and to imperial political communities. Inspired by Africanist scholarship on kinship and dependency and anthropological studies of belonging, I asked what it would mean to rethink freedom in the early modern Atlantic as an ongoing struggle over belonging that began in captivity and continued into freedom. I argue that becoming free in the South Atlantic involved a fundamental transformation in belonging that formerly enslaved peoples confronted and negotiated. In this early modern Atlantic world, freedom and belonging were intimately intertwined and often at the center of contests over manumission. In each part of the Atlantic basin, belonging and sociality saturated the ways Africans and their descendants spoke of freedom before notaries, judges, and monarchs. Enslaved people summoned witnesses from their community in legal freedom suits. Petitioners claimed positions as vassals of the Portuguese crown to access justice. Enslaved women with promises of freedom chose powerful godparents for their newborns to redirect relations of dependency away from their enslavers. And Black Catholic brotherhoods freed their members so that they would become dependents on the wider corporate community. Under slavery, belonging mitigated vulnerability and confronted what Vincent Brown called the predicament of social death. In freedom, belonging furnished protection and security born from relationships of reciprocity, obligation, and dependency, and which protected people's freed status and established webs of protection against re-enslavement. At the turn of the 18th century, Salvador Bahia was the capital of Portuguese America and a bustling Atlantic entrepot that connected the region's sugar plantations to the wider Atlantic world. The city was home to upwards of 30 to 40,000 residents, half of whom were enslaved. It was here that Marcelina Dias Silvestre lived and worked. But frustratingly, only fragments of her life have survived. We know that she was born sometime in the 1660s, and given the regional trends of the slave trade to Brazil in the final decades of the 17th century, she was most likely from West Central Africa. It's kind of my argument is that she's from West Central Africa, from the region of Angola, the Kingdom of Congo. Her first owner was a man named João Dias Silvestre, whose surname she adopted as her own. And so here I'm going to give a little bit of her story that we know, and this is sort of a timeline so that you can kind of follow along with it. Sometime in the 1690s, her first enslaver, her first owner, João Dias Silvestre, died, and Marcelina was sold to a new owner named Ana Maria de Souza. According to Marcelina, she was horrified to learn that Ana Maria de Souza was a prostitute who forced her into the same line of work. Prostitution was no secret in port cities like Salvador. Travelers regularly commented on it, and the king condemned it in his letters and laws. But Marcelina had no interest in what she saw as the perversion of her enslaver. Instead, Marcelina agreed to marry a white carpenter named João de Miranda, who was perhaps one of her clients and who offered to pay for her freedom. Their marriage would become the basis not only for her escaping prostitution, but also for her to escape enslavement. Marcelina negotiated a price for her freedom with her enslaver, with her owner, Ana Maria de Souza. But when the time came to pay, her enslaver broke their verbal agreement and refused to manumit her. To enforce the agreement, Marcelina then sued her enslaver on the grounds that money had been exchanged for her freedom, but that she never received a freedom letter. Her freedom suit eventually reached both Bahia's and Portugal's high appeal courts, but each time judges found in favor of her enslaver and against the validity of her freedom. Having exhausted the established channels of law, Marcelina turned to another strategy. She directly petitioned the Portuguese crown for grace. Subjects of Portugal and its overseas empire directly petitioned Portuguese monarchs for what were known as private acts of justice, which were known as grace. These acts of grace were central to the representation of the monarch as the dispenser of justice and the benevolent patriarch of vassals, as this image begins to demonstrate. In theory, grace dispensed by the crown, these acts of grace, provided a measure of equilibrium to judicial and extrajudicial matters that the courts, as instruments of justice, failed to resolve. The very act of petitioning the crown was thus a particular claim by Marcelina and other enslaved people to belonging as insiders of the imperial political community. At its core, Marcelina's petition to King Pedro II was a moral condemnation of her enslavement. Her freedom suit years earlier had sought to fulfill a broken manumission agreement, but now her petition to the king directly made a different argument altogether. That the suffering she endured under her enslaver created restitutive pathways to freedom. In the opening lines alone, which are pictured here, Marcelina critiqued her enslaver and made an implicit claim to freedom. In Brazil, most enslaved people only used a first name. Only after gaining their freedom did formerly enslaved peoples adopt a surname, a last name, and these typically came from the individuals that manumitted them. But Marcelina here adopted the surname of her first owner, her deceased owner, João Dias Silvestre, and not her enslaver, Ana Maria de Souza. So by adopting her deceased former owner's surname, Marcelina staunchly refused affiliation with Ana Maria de Souza and opened her petition with an implicit critique of the woman she hopes to escape from. The petition continued by describing Marcelina's litigation against her enslaver. Marcelina explained that her enslaver pocketed the money that was meant to purchase her freedom, and had even gone so far as to convince witnesses to lie about it. But Marcelina's failed freedom suit was only the backstory to the real injustice she alleged in this new petition, that she had been subjected to abuse and cruelty resulting from and since the initiation of the freedom suit. According to Marcelina, quote, during the freedom suit, Ana Maria de Souza detained her in spite of the bond she paid for her services. This was a reference to the fact that Marcelina lived in the custody. During the course of her litigation, she lived in the custody of a neutral third party. During freedom litigation, enslaved people were granted reprieve from living under the same roof as their enslavers due to the very real threat of violent retribution. Many enslaved litigants initiated freedom suits knowing they would be removed from their enslaver's home, even if only temporarily. Their temporary absence could play in their favor in negotiations to ameliorate their enslavement or even to negotiate freedom outside of the litigation process. But the opposite happened to Marcelina. So vengeful was Marcelina's enslaver that she had, quote, had become so hateful towards Marcelina that she publicly said that she would suffocate her, and she is capable of doing so because of her bad condition and little fear of God. And for this, she wanted Marcelina to return to her service.
Wow.
With all legal channels exhausted, Marcelina argued that returning to the home of her enslaver would worsen the violence and anguish that she suffered. For one, she explained to the crown that her prospective husband, the man who offered to pay for her freedom, who promised to pay for her freedom, had died while traveling the Atlantic Ocean. Her kinship with him once represented her pathway out of slavery. Her kinship with him once represented her pathway out of slavery and sexual exploitation, but his death now made her more vulnerable. More forcefully, in what I view as one of the petition's most important passages, Marcelina pleaded that she was, quote, more than 40 years old and suffering from ailments that almost always leave her bedridden. And it is not good to return to her master, where she will infallibly have a bad captivity. So the question that we can ask ourselves here is, what did Marcelina mean by bad captivity? What was this invocation? And here I'm going to step away a bit from Marcelina and put her in the context of the larger Atlantic world in this period to try and understand sort of her arguments. Marcelina's invocation of quote unquote bad captivity places her within a broader Black Atlantic critique of enslavement that emerged during her lifetime. Beginning in the 1680s, enslaved people, freed people, and Black Catholic brotherhoods in Brazil and in Portugal forged new discourses and vernacular vocabularies to morally critique their enslavement. In royal petitions, appeals for corporate privileges, and freedom suits, these groups constructed the notion of quote unquote a bad captivity as a flexible concept to delineate the limits of a tolerable captivity, which was defined not only by acts of physical harm, so excessive punishment, but also the moral anguish and emotional suffering those acts engendered. Historians of Brazil are often more familiar with the reforms and legislation introduced by Jesuit missionaries and the Portuguese king at the turn of the 18th century. And some of those are pictured here. And the image on the right from 1758, we have a copy here there's a copy here at the Beinecke, so go consult it in person. Historians of Brazil are often more familiar with the reforms and legislation introduced by Jesuit missionaries and the Portuguese king at the turn of the 18th century. Rather than attacks on slavery, these were aimed at making slavery, quote unquote, more efficient in a Christian empire. And during the age of Palmares, Brazil's massive fugitive slave community that the Portuguese until the mid-1690s had struggled to conquer. But emerging Black discourses on slavery and freedom in the 1680s sometimes paralleled these reformist efforts by addressing mistreatment and abuse. But these Black discourses were distinct from the reformist efforts in a crucial way. They went beyond denouncing mistreatment to critique the conditions of enslavement through a moral economy of slavery. And here I have just some examples. I won't talk about all of them, but I just wanted to give you a list of examples that I draw from in the book to sort of think about this period as a larger moment of Black claims making in the Atlantic world. Arguably, the best known voice from this period was an individual named Lourenço da Silva Mendonça, who was an Ndongo royal who traveled to the offices of the Propaganda Fide in Rome to protest Atlantic slavery and lobby for an abolition decree. This was in the 1680s. Thanks to the work of historian José Ligna Nafafe, We know that Da Silva Mendonça's odyssey from Angola to Brazil to Portugal and then to Rome collected the experiences of enslaved peoples throughout the South Atlantic. Drawing on wider African understandings of bodily injury and malady as political problems, he likened the enslavement of Black Christians to an unhealed wound. He described in no uncertain terms the brutal punishments meted out to enslaved people, including their subjection to being burnt, quote, with sealing wax, lard, resin, pitch, and other materials. Several years later, in 1686, a freed African man from Salvador Bahia, the same city where Marcelina lived, traveled to Rome on behalf of the city's Black confraternities, Black religious communities, to, quote, place himself at the feet of His Holiness with a petition explaining the miserable state that all Black Christians in this and other cities in the Kingdom of America faced. The construct of a bad captivity, mau cativeiro, emerges most explicitly in the appeals by Black Catholic brotherhoods for royal privileges. These lay communities were formed in Brazil, Angola, and Portugal over the course of the slave trade and became important mutual aid associations and communities of spiritual kinship for enslaved people. In 1684, the Brotherhood of Our Lady of the Rosary and Redemption in Rio petitioned the Portuguese king for corporate privileges to free their members suffering, quote, from, quote unquote, ruim cativeiro, which is the same, bad captivity, which is the same word, the same phrase that Marcelina uses 2 decades later. Similar appeals for privileges were made by other brotherhoods in Brazil and in Portugal as well within the same decade. So there's a lot happening in the 1680s with regards to critiques of enslavement. And it's kind of coming from different perspectives and from different individuals and communities. Besides offering important countercurrents to the reformist efforts of Jesuits and crown officials during the same era, these examples demonstrate that enslaved people across the South Atlantic developed vernacular vocabularies in the 1680s and in the 1690s to describe the suffering of the enslaved with the hope of charting new paths towards manumission, towards legal freedom. By the time Marcelina petitioned the Portuguese crown in 1700, a flexible framework of bad captivity circulated to such an extent that she and her legal representatives could invoke it to characterize her enslavement as intolerable and worthy of the king's justice. The justice that she pleaded for was royally affirmed manumission. In other words, she asked the crown, she asked the king to free her, to write an order that would free her. Marcelina's petition explained that she was prepared to pay her enslaver whatever her market price for her freedom, if the king decreed it. So the question I wanted to try and think about now, again, step away from Marcelina for just a moment to think about in a broader context, is why she offered to pay for her manumission at the same time that she denounced her enslavement. In other words, what was in the offer to pay for the manumission? Marcelina's willingness to pay for her manumission reflected both her desire to sever ties with her enslaver in a finite way, in other words, to break all ties, all potential ties with her. But it also represented a unique innovation on an Atlantic-wide practice that is sometimes known as master switching, sometimes known as change of ownership. So what I'm referring to here as master switching and changes of ownership refers to a process in which enslaved people initiated a legally recognized change of ownership, often because of poor treatment, physical abuse, and the breakdown of mutual but uneven expectations. Changes of ownership practices were recognized as legitimate practices both in the Iberian empires and in Atlantic Africa. In Brazil and Spanish America, as is widely known by scholars, for example, enslaved people accrued the right to denounce their abusive owners, which gradually transformed into a right to initiate their sale to a new owner who would presumably treat them better. In fact, Portugal's king reaffirmed this practice of master switching in the 1680s, the same decade in which the phrase bad captivity first becomes used in petition. And so on the left here of the screen, you can see sort of just a very sort of simple genealogy of different moments in Atlantic history and Iberian history in which changes of ownership practices are affirmed by authorities and the king, including in Goa in India in 1599. Master switching changes of ownership practices are also widely attested to in Atlantic Africa, and that's here on the right side. Comparative historical linguists and historians have excavated lexicons, rituals, and traditions of marriage in Atlantic Africa, so from Angola to Senegal, that attest to customary practices of changes of ownership. These Atlantic African practices were grounded in understandings of slavery, dependency, and the mutual but uneven obligations between enslaved peoples and enslavers. In other words, that enslavers could not have complete and total dominion, that there was limits to their power, that there were limits to their mastery. In West Central Africa, for example, the region broadly the region of Angola, enslaved people could flee their enslavement to a new prospective owner whom they perceived to be more powerful, against whom they would commit a crime. As punishment, the aggrieved prospective owner would take ownership of the enslaved person as retribution for the crime, and this would initiate a legally recognized change of ownership. These practices are also attested to in further north in regions of West Africa, and I have just a few examples here of the distribution of certain words that describe this practice in Kikongo and Angela communities and languages, speech communities, Sierra Leone, and among the Wolof. Traces of these practices also appear in the frustratingly patchy and often incomplete archives of 17th and 18th century Brazil. And something I get into in the larger book project is, how these different sort of legal practices from Africa and from the Iberian Peninsula sort of become intelligible to each other in the space of Brazil and the space of Luanda and Lisbon. Okay, so let me come back now to Marcelina's petition and try and explain why I had us to those different practices. What is particularly striking about master switching in Brazil was its gradual evolution into self-purchase, in other words, people paying for their own freedom, rather than sale to a new owner. Right, so rather than being sold to a new owner, they say instead that I will pay for my freedom instead. This is precisely what Marcelina's petition did. Denouncing her enslavement, Marcelina made a novel argument that enslaved people in Brazil would repeat over the next 2 centuries. In theory, enslaved people who suffered from excessive punishment had recourse to denounce their enslavement and request their sale to a new enslaver. Even though enslavers lost their dominion over an enslaved person, according to this logic, they would still recoup their loss, as it were, through funds generated by the sale. But Marcelina, in her petition, did not ask for a change of ownership. Instead, she asked to pay for her own manumission, avoiding sale and escaping slavery entirely. In effect, she would become owner of herself. This was an argument that modified the logic of master switching to frame manumission by self-purchase as a form of justice. On March 18th, 1701, Portugal's King Pedro II responded favorably to Marcelina's petition. One of his counselors drafted a royal order to Bahia's governor with the following text, which is pictured here, both the original document and a transcription of it and translation. The text read, Marcelina Dias Silvestre sent the enclosed petition to your majesty. And because the suit that she brought against her master will result in ill will and quote unquote bad captivity, your majesty orders that her master be obliged to accept the price at which she was evaluated and grant her a freedom letter. If her master does not comply, pass the matter on to the justices. In other words, have the judges force her to do this. By repeating the phrase mal cativeiro or ruim cativeiro, bad captivity, in the order to free Marcelina that's pictured here, the king and his counselors affirmed her justification for manumission. Tragically, Marcelina may never have actually gained her freedom, even with the king's order. 2 consecutive Brazilian governors in Bahia refused to obey the king, citing their fears that enslaved people in Brazil who learned of Marcelina's freedom would simply make false allegations to gain their manumission. Inherent in this fear was an awareness of public networks among the enslaved that circulated knowledge about contests over freedom. As much as direct appeals to the crown were so-called private acts of justice, they became part of broader conversations about slavery, freedom, and mastery among enslaved people, their enslavers, and colonial authorities. Bahia's governors believed that the real threat was not Marcelina's manumission per se, but public knowledge of it. Nevertheless, they couldn't contain that knowledge for very long. Despite the governor's refusal to free Marcelina, other enslaved petitioners, particularly women, followed in her footsteps by sending their own appeals to the king. Here again, I sort of have the evidence that I draw on in the book to make this, but I'm just going to talk about just a few cases, but it gives you a sense of petitioning activity in the years following Marcelina's petition. So in 1704, just 3 years after Marcelina's petition, an enslaved woman named Custodia Teles in the same city of Salvador, Bahia, petitioned the crown alleging that she had been forced into quote unquote illicit acts by her male enslaver. When she refused it, he brutally punished her. Like her contemporary Marcelina, Custodia asked the crown to approve her manumission by self-purchase on the grounds that the sexual violence she suffered from warranted the king's justice. Importantly, the crown accepted Custodia's petition and decreed that she be freed. 1 year later, another enslaved woman, Maria do Pilar, also petitioned the crown, explaining that she had fled her enslaver's sexual violence rather than submit to him. Maria do Pilar had initiated a freedom suit, but she was unable to afford the appeals process and instead turned directly to the crown, requesting that she be allowed to pay for her freedom. Around the same time, an enslaved woman named Teodosia de Barros petitioned the Portuguese crown, appealing for her freedom from what she called, quote unquote, a rigorous captivity, which the crown accepted. The crown freed her as well. So these women, Custodia Teles, Maria do Pilar, Teodosia de Barros, and others that I unfortunately don't have the time to discuss here, were contemporaries of Marcelina and Salvador Bahia. If they didn't meet or know her personally, they surely must have learned about her petition, her freedom suit, even as Bahia's governor sought to keep it hidden from the public. These examples point towards several important conclusions about Marcelina's appeal within years of its circulation. The first, as I've sort of already alluded to, is that royal petitioning in Bahia increased in the years following Marcelina's appeal. To suggest that this was merely by coincidence is to silence enslaved people's capacity as historical agents to engage in knowledge exchange, even under the most precarious of circumstances. Perhaps even more significant is the fact that these petitioners were all women, and many denounced sexual violence and exploitation. Just as historians have insisted that enslavement in the Americas was a gendered phenomenon, insight that I take very seriously in my work, enslaved women in the early 18th century expressed gendered claims to freedom, security, and moral integrity in the ways that they constructed the notion of a bad captivity. Since I first encountered Marcelina in Brazil's archives nearly 10 years ago, I spent a lot of time thinking about and thinking with her, reconstructing the genealogy of her arguments and situating her within a larger context of Black claims making at the turn of the 18th century. I've taken her seriously as a legal thinker, not only because her petition created a framework for amplifying enslaved women's claims in the early 18th century, but also because enslaved people 100 years after her petition, after her own lifetime, remarkably continued to reference her in their own appeals. In 1803, for example, an enslaved man in Salvador Bahia named Eusebio petitioned Prince Regent João VI. He alleged that following his owner's death, he and others had become subjected to excessive punishment by his enslavers' descendants. In arguing for freedom, Eusebio cited, quote unquote, Marcelina Dias, which is underlined here in orange, and her royal order from March 18th, 1701. Similarly, a few years later, an enslaved woman named Victoria Maria, also in Salvador Bahia, petitioned the prince for her freedom to free herself from her enslavers' cruel punishments. In Victoria Maria's petition, she cited a royal order dated March 18, 1701, which is unquestionably, in my opinion, a reference to Marcelina a century earlier. Finally, on the eve of Brazilian independence in 1821, an enslaved woman named Magdalena in the city of Rio de Janeiro, further south from Salvador Bahia, cited Marcelina by name. In her appeal, Magdalena claimed that she had served her owner for over 16 years, but still, quote unquote, suffered during this entire time the most cruel and ferocious punishments without deserving them. The conclusion of her petition reconstructed the royal order that freed Marcelina over a century earlier. So I have it cited here and translated. The royal decree of March 18, 1701 compelled the master of the slave Marcelina, resident of Bahia, to confer a letter of manumission after receiving her payment. And if they refused to do so, the justices would pass the letter of manumission. So just to reinforce this again, these are enslaved petitioners over 100 years after Marcelina's own petition who are continually drawing on her precedent and her as an example. So I'm trying to take seriously this, the notion that she has something to tell us about Brazilian legal history because enslaved people are telling us that she does. So, conclude here. And by the early 19th century, the particularities of Marcelina's circumstances, and by some indications, even the vocabulary of quote unquote bad captivity had faded, but the legitimacy of her arguments had not. Her significance in her own lifetime and her appearance in petitions 1 century later speaks to the long and connected histories of enslaved people's legal struggles for freedom, which my larger book project sets out to trace. Marcelina's petition, only 2 pages long, highlights the promises of thinking about freedom through an African diasporic and South Atlantic framework. She drew on and modified practices of master switching common to both African and Iberian legal cultures, and adapted frameworks of bad captivity circulating in the Atlantic world to the particularities of sexually exploited and vulnerable enslaved women. She was a legal thinker under the most precarious of circumstances who deserves a place in the social, political, and legal histories of early modern Brazil. Certainly, those who cited her long after her lifetime believe that she does. Much like other figures studied in my larger book manuscript, she experienced the path to freedom through overlapping and contested claims to belonging. She refused affiliation with her owner, adopting the surname of her deceased enslaver, while also negotiating her freedom through her marriage agreement. Her marriage partner's death, described in her petition, captured how vulnerable one could become when protective kinships were taken away. At a broader scale, Marcelina and other petitioners claimed positions as insiders of the imperial political community through the very act of appealing for justice. Their stories and others that I excavate in my research are crucial reminders that Africans and their descendants rejected the alienation and the dispossession at the core of enslavement and viewed the Atlantic world as a space to condemn slavery and to recreate lineages of freedom. So I'm going to end there, and I'm happy to take questions, and really appreciate people's attention and attendance. Thank you.
This is remarkable for a host of ways, and I have questions and comments, but let's open it up first to our in-room audience, and then Michelle, I think, is monitoring our remote audience where the questions are also coming in. Who's first in the room? Yes, ma'am.
Question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk. So your discussion of Marcelina kind of reminded me a little bit of The Intimacy of Four Continents by Lisa Lowe, particularly the chapter on Equiano, where Lisa Lowe traces how Equiano's like perception of freedom shifts as he changes from like an enslaved person to someone who is negotiating the possibility of being enslaved and engaging in capitalism. And so she kind of makes this argument that he begins to switch social freedom to economic freedom, right? Like the ability to participate in economic freedom. And so I was wondering if maybe some of that stuff is happening and being reinforced, and why, because I think she steps back and says, like, how does this not just disrupt perceptions of discourses of freedom, but how is it actually being reinforced by liberalism, right? And maybe that has to do with why you're finding a lot of women, because women have a tendency to not have self-autonomy or independence often inherently granted to them. So I was just wondering if that's something that you're seeing is like maybe their perception, it's reinforcing a relationship of capitalism as they're trying to find a different way of talking about their freedom or perceived freedom.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Christine. Thank you. I'll have to go back and reread Lisa Lowe's book on this that you cited. I think in some ways, you know, I'm not sure if this is going to answer your question, so please let me know. But I think in some ways, I think about freedom in sort of a multidimensional aspect. And so what I've been getting at in my book manuscript and in this particular petition is pathways, particularly to legal freedom, right? A particular idea that manumission is a legal instrument that does reinforce slavery. We know from generations of scholars that manumission over the course of the 19th century can chip away at slavery. But for the most part, it reinforces enslavement. It acts as, in some cases, almost a safety valve. So I recognize freedom as sort of the legal instrument here. But in terms of what you're referring to as well, I think part of what draws me to these particular petitions is the idea that women are recognizing and saying to the king, yes, we are in the most intimate spaces of these cities. We are in the domestic spaces of these cities as workers, oftentimes forced into sex work by our enslavers. And it's that particular gendered claim to freedom that's being, that's really elevating these claims and sort of having a larger impact in South Atlantic society. So, yeah, I think what you said makes a lot of sense, and I'm trying to think about it in terms of the circumstances and the conditions that lead these enslaved women to make these particular claims, because these are very particularly gendered and sexualized claims that they're making. Yeah, thank you.
Who's next? Michael.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Can you parse out a little bit more for me, John, when the difference between the moral argument and the legal argument? Because it seems that initially Marcelina's making the argument to Jesuit priests on the idea that this is a spiritual type of violation. She even, in the petition, it even says that her owner, the prostitute that put her to work, fears no God or something like that.
Yeah.
But then it becomes a legal precedent of sort. You even use the term precedent quite a few times. So I'm wondering, how does this, or am I missing that it was primarily a spiritual argument? Was it a legal argument? How does the spiritual justification become sort of codified as precedent as a legal basis that others are using to point to?
Yeah, this is where it becomes really kind of in the weeds and complicated, because one of the longstanding beliefs in the scholarship is that these petitions for grace were sort of extra legal, they were extrajudicial, they operated outside of the legal system because they were made directly to the king. And I think over the course of my research and in the book, I sort of complicate that idea, because the petitions, people are making very legalistic claims, but the forum of royal appeals are for people to be able to gain things like pardon and grace, acts of justice from the crown. So they become these really interesting spaces, perhaps more so, I would argue, than in freedom suits or legal suits that are pursued through the civil courts. They become spaces where moral and legal arguments become one and the same. That there's something about these individuals and the circumstances that they're suffering, that the moral suffering, the moral indignation, the moral condemnation that they're making on their enslavers exceeds what the law permits them to do, right? So enslavers then lose dominion, they forfeit their mastery over this process. And so I guess I guess maybe what I'm trying to get at is that I don't see the moral and the legal as too far separated in these particular petitions. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thanks so much, John, for the presentation. I will go back to your question that you posed initially, which is, what did it mean to become free in a world so deeply marked by unfreedom? And I want to ask you how you use unfreedom throughout maybe this chapter, a specific case, or in the case of the book, how unfreedom appears, because I think there's a lot of new discussions, theoretical and conceptual, about how unfreedom appears here in these histories. And my other question, it is about gender, the gender dynamic that you highlighted, but I was thinking about the gender dynamic between Marcelina and the second owner, about how she's way that she accused of being more abrasive or being more violent or being more irrational plays here with some certain gender notions or gender norms or gender stereotypes that reinforces some kind of like dispute among both of them. And also with the aspect about being accused of putting to work as a prostitute, I was thinking about then what are kind of like the labor's pathways that were available for her as a free woman after the case, if it eventually happened or not, but also before, as an enslaved woman, what would be a tolerable work that she would be, okay, I'm an enslaved woman, but this is the type of work that maybe under Sylvia, the first owner, she would say that was tolerable, and she would have some kind of like more control over the type of, because it feels sometimes in the way that it's described almost that she had kind of like a condition of a escravo de ganho, in a way. I don't think that you're saying that, but kind of like I was thinking if she had some kind of like agreement that was kind of like, I'm forgetting the word for escravo de ganho in English, so please.
Slaves for hire.
Yeah. So I was thinking if that would be maybe something that you consider in this case as well.
Thank you, Manuel, for the question. In terms of unfreedom, I've been just trying to think really a lot about, as I mentioned, how we need to move away. And this is, I'm not innovating this by any means, but we need to move away in the early modern period from a dichotomy of slavery and freedom, and more think about the degrees of freedom, as Michelle McKinley brilliantly talks about, fractional freedoms that people kind of accrue over their lifetime. And so unfreedom is appearing in my book as a way to think about that enslaved people, formerly enslaved peoples, are always in positions of precarity. They're always subject and vulnerable to re-enslavement. And Portuguese law permits former slave owners to re-enslave their former captives. And so it's that condition of precarity that I'm trying to understand. And I suppose what I'm suggesting is that bonds of belonging that are sort of renegotiated and reimagined in freedom help protect people against that. So I'm really trying to think about the fact, what it means, for example, that when people are become free, they still seek out forms of dependency on powerful individuals. They still recognize that there are incredible hierarchies that exist in society, and they want to insert themselves into those relationships because it offers them some kind of protection. So I'm thinking about it kind of in those terms, and I'm actually still really thinking through what the term unfreedom means and how it appears in this work. And so
which is a deeply African tradition.
yes, yeah, yeah.
You had to belong somehow.
Yes,
You had to be a client somehow.
Yeah.
In many cultures.
Yeah, and this was true in African societies, but I would also argue that it was true in Iberian societies.
Sure.
And that's one of the areas where these two societies become intelligible, is the idea that hierarchies are sort of naturalized to social and political relationships. Everyone has to figure out their place in a particular society, in a particular hierarchy. The notion of individuality simply doesn't make sense in this case. The notion of a freed person as an individual, socially mobile, kind of doing things on their own, it just doesn't exist in this context.
And John, that kind of plays a part, you kind of tied into what I was thinking about when he was talking about the indentured servant, and the concept of freedom, the concept of enfranchisement, the concept of even more like on a more modernized basis of how even like now in our society, people who are indebted to credit card companies, any kind of debtor, whether it be enslavement physically, not chains, not physical capture, but to the fact that they cannot afford services, they cannot afford housing, they cannot afford food. You know, that it's still a form of enslavement that we don't think of as enslavement, but it really truly is. And unless you have walked in the shoes of someone who cannot live comfortably in a society where they're expected to be able to, you know, have all of the American dreams, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and then only to find out that it's a fairy tale, a daydream. You know, that the concept that you just cannot ever get ahead, you cannot ever be on a level footing with the society per se, but we as a group of people don't recognize that that is enslavement, that that is a form of captivity for some people.
Yeah, thank you so much for
Landlord and renters.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's getting worse. It's not getting better.
All the different ways in our modern society that we've inherited long-standing practices of debt, long-standing practices of dependency that you just talked about. And so that's really powerful. Thank you for bringing that up. And it makes me think about the particular argument then that I'm thinking of in my research, is that I'm sort of suggesting that people recognize that as well. People who become free recognize that as well, and realize that one of the ways to confront that is through collectivity, through mechanisms of protection, rituals, kinship, societies that exist throughout the Atlantic world that people embed themselves in to confront that. But yeah, thank you for that really powerful observation. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah, 3 questions, but I'll make them all quick. Do you think with Marcelina, when she changes her name, is that an attempt to avoid, like to establish a new patronage network, to avoid her former enslaver, right? Trying, because she knows she needs a patron, but she doesn't want the one who most recently enslaved her. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
Are there any other forms? Is this really the only form of violence, of abuse, of sexual abuse that results in petitions like this? It doesn't happen in other forms. That's fascinating. And then the third one, how does the memory of Marcelina persist? I mean, a century later, this precedent is still being cited.
Yeah.
And does it, how does that happen? What's the mechanism for that to happen?
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of the, thank you, Ed. In terms of the patronage network, I mean, the individual who she sort of claims the surname from has deceased. And what's really interesting about that particular case is that if he's deceased and he had heirs or descendants, for example, in theory, that she would, through kind of property law, become part of his heirs. So that doesn't seem to be the case here. She seems to be sold. So it's unclear to me exactly what her relationship is to him. He doesn't seem to have written a testament, a last will and testament to free her. There's something about the affiliation with him that is important to her and it may suggest that she sees her current enslaver and her current enslavement as unjust or illegitimate. But in terms of, it's just hard to know because all we have is these 2-page petitions that I mentioned. In terms of the kinds of violence, over the course of 100 years, 200 years, people make all kinds of different claims about violence. It's not just sexual violence and sexual exploitation, as I talked about here. But this particular moment I'm suggesting is when these claims come to the fore. It's this particular early 18th century moment, the sort of these petitioners who I talk about here, including to the bottom, Hosamina, which I talk about much more at length. These are the petitions that are coming to the fore during this moment. But over the longer course, different forms of violence, and people also include really play with the idea of what violence means and redefine violence enslaved people do. So, for example, one form of violence that's often discussed in certain petitions is when families are being separated and enslaved individuals will petition the Portuguese crown to say that this is actually a form of violence against this family, that you're separating them, and so there's multiple kinds of violences that are talked about, but this particular moment that I'm interested in, there's particular gendered claims that are coming to the fore. And I apologize. The memory. Yeah, this is a great question. Yeah. So one of the interesting things that I didn't have a chance to talk about here is that I recently in Portugal over the summer was at the National Archives and perusing. No one really knows whose it was, but it was clearly a judicial authority, a judge's own personal book of decrees, royal orders on a whole range of topics from Brazil. And this was compiled probably in the early 19th century, so around the time that people are starting to bring her back into the public discourse. And her royal order is part of his collection of laws.
So it is partly legal precedent.
It is legal, yes. She's making a very sort of intersected moral and legal argument, but she becomes sort of legal precedent for these individuals. And this judicial authority who has this compilation of laws sees something in her particular appeal that so there's other moments when she's kind of transpiring in the archives. It's very hard to know, some people, skeptics might say that these are just kind of lawyers who are writing these petitions and sort of finding precedents in the governor's notebooks of old decrees and whatnot, and then sort of bringing those back into light. But even if we accept that, they're still bringing an enslaved woman from 100 years earlier.
Does she ever appear in like parades and rituals as a folkloric figure?
Not to my knowledge, but we have to assume.
That's what I would guess.
One of the things that's really fascinating to me, and I think speaks to how this might look like in daily life, is that we know that her royal order is Marcelina Dias Silvestre as her name, but here she's referred to as Marcelina Dias, and then in another petition she's referred to simply as Marcelina. And so we can almost kind of imagine how people are speaking about her and dropping parts of her name and only keeping her first name. And so
but Brazil is such a performative culture.
Yes.
But no wondering if she's not some figure in parades or something.
To my knowledge, no. But there are, I still this particular example I came across or she's cited here. I only came across last year, so it's really, I think there's still these sources out there and we just don't know. But just the last thing I'll say about it is that, petitions, when they were written, there were collaborative processes.
Right.
So they were read out loud back to the petitioners. And so again, even a skeptical, view of this, someone would still learn about Marcelina and share that information. And so, but yeah, it's something I wish I had a great answer for, but we can only really sort of speculate.
Because it seems like enslaved people through these petitions, especially when they're accepted, are almost policing the boundaries of acceptable mastery, right? Because they're saying
They're trying to.
they're trying to, and when the king approves, that kind of sets a limit, right? Like this isn't okay. Slavery is okay, but this within slavery is not okay. And that's a really interesting process that certainly in the Anglo-Americans doesn't have precedent, that's not a thing.
So Michelle has been curating the online questions.
Yes.
Folks
are
give us some of the best.
jumping at the bit.
Okay.
So lots of thanks for your great presentation. We have a couple of questions about who prepared and submitted the petition.
Yeah.
And whether there's organized groups working toward freedom for slaves in Brazil at this time.
The Jesuit priest.
Can I answer that question?
Yeah.
Okay. So who prepared these? This is a very interesting question because litigation that happens within the court, freedom suits, involve legal representatives who have some kind of capacity to engage with judges, to engage with notaries, to make these legal arguments before.
Like scribes.
Yes, yeah. The process for writing a royal petition did not necessarily involve an individual with the same skill set. It just required an individual who could read and write, who could write the petition. That being said, unfortunately, we don't know much about who wrote these appeals. As you can see here, this is the entirety of the appeal that exists, that has been handed down. There's no signature of the individual who wrote it. Occasionally we do see signatures, such as the one down here. You can see como procurador as representative Joaquim José da Rocha. And then we can sort of work backwards to try and understand these. But these would have been legal representatives in general, perhaps individuals who would have been paid. Another theory that I have, and unfortunately without signatures or clear indications of who wrote these, I don't know, is that the Black Catholic Brotherhoods also formed an important role in writing these petitions. These were organizations of enslaved Christians, enslaved Black Christians, who formed mutual aid associations. And this kind of gets to the second question about organized groups. Were there organized groups during this period? Well, the Jesuits always had different ideas about avenues to freedom, and they had even proposed, there's some documentation suggesting that they had proposed laws towards freedom, towards manumission. But the real important groups would have been the Black Catholic Brotherhoods. And that was true not only in Brazil, but also in Luanda, Angola, and Portugal as well. The Portuguese Black Brotherhoods were incredibly powerful. One of their primary functions, above all else, was the freedom of its members.
Does Brotherhood have pathways to, royal pathways? How does this get to the monarch?
Yeah, they over the course of several centuries appealed for corporate privileges to free their members.
Oh, okay.
In other words, saying to the monarch, can we please have the ability to purchase our members' freedom? And so this is true in the Portuguese case. The Brazilian Brotherhood struggled to get these corporate privileges for understandable reasons, but the Portuguese Brotherhoods are incredibly powerful towards freedom, freedom making. Yeah.
We have a lot more online, if I can get to a couple more. So Richard Turretts asks,
Hi, Richard.
whether there were customary norms, laws, or privileges or state mechanisms for freedom price evaluation for the enslaved to purchase their freedom at a fair market price in Brazil. He says there were in Santo Domingo and ultimately in the Spanish Empire in the 1770s.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, for your question. This becomes part of the contest over manumission because oftentimes the petitions will denounce kind of unfair price evaluations. And so enslaved people will often call upon the monarch or Brazilian governors or viceroys or whoever is in charge of a particular region to have someone in official capacity assess their market value outside of their slave owner. I haven't looked too much into that process, but one of the things that you see in the petitions is a request not just for freedom by self-purchase, but that someone is assigned to execute that assessment of their market value. There's always market value is always the sort of desire that people have to, yeah.
And Tiago Kraus,
Hi, Tiago.
All your friends are on.
Um,
Michael brought about 30 it is.
he thanks you for the great presentation, and he asks that you think a little bit more about the context of late 17th century Atlantic world, why this concentration in Brazil and the presence of other fascinating cases such as the Lima Pardos, studied by Karen Graubert,
Yeah.
the 1688 Germantown petition, the Cuban Capuchinos, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, this is it's a great question. Definitely we'll think more about that and talk about it to some extent. I mean, one way that this gets interpreted by enslaved people is in terms of who is actually king when someone's reign begins and when a king passes away. So there's a real flurry of activity during the reign of Pedro II in the final decades of the 17th century, which is also an important part of the story because once we get into the reign of the next king, we start to see the petitions decrease a little bit. And you can almost sort of map the petitions based on the reign of individual kings.
And some develop a record of doing this. You better get them while they're alive.
Pedro II, the king who frees Marcelina, his confessor, I consulted this in Portugal over the summer, his confessor writes a kind of biography of Pedro II and says that he had a tradition of freeing enslaved people who claimed violence, that they were suffering from violence. So it was something of his.
Back in Bahia, they didn't know that.
Yes, yeah.
And then if I can bring Stuart Schwartz into our room, he's online.
Welcome back.
He says in his book of 1985, he mentions the case of Marcelina, but also the case of Ursula in 1690. Who was successful in getting her freedom in similar circumstances. In that case, there seems to be intervention of the archbishop. So does the appeal to ecclesiastical authority rather than civil or secular provide a more effective approach? Do others use it?
I think that's a great question. Yeah, thank you, Stuart. I should say that the first person in the English language scholarship to cite this petition was Stuart Schwartz. So I really owe it to him for finding these petitions, and he talks about it in his.
He's a reindeer, just sort of.
So the other individual I have here is Stuart. If you can see my screen, is Ursula in this sort of list of individuals who are making these claims. Is Ursula in Bahia in 1690, an enslaved woman who is enslaved by a very powerful family in Bahia, in I believe a rural area in Bahia, and she makes the claim that for her suffering, she should be granted her. I can't remember off the top of my head if she asked for freedom, but she asked for, I believe, to be sold to a new owner, and I think the king might say, well, she can be sold to a new owner or be freed. And one of the things that I believe the king does, Stuart, if I remember correctly, is rather than write to the Bahian governor, he writes to an ecclesiastic, the archbishop, to say, you have to intervene in this particular case. So it's unclear to me whether she originally appeals to the archbishop or whether the king decides that the archbishop is someone who should be involved in this particular case. But we do see over the course of the 18th century that religious and ecclesiastical authorities are very involved in discussing these kinds of conflicts. So it's something that I'll certainly think about. Unfortunately, the ecclesiastical archives beyond baptism and marriage and death records are a bit thin for this period, and so it's hard to know for certain.
Is the slave trade peaking in this particular moment of late 17th, early 18th century into Bahia? Is that a factor at all?
So, I mean, yes. I mean, one of the things that's happening is that gold is discovered in Minas Gerais, which is, let's see if I can bring up my map again. Gold is discovered in Minas Gerais. And so one of the things that happens is that enslaved Africans are trafficked to Brazil and brought through Bahia and Rio de Janeiro to furnish the labor for mining gold in this period. And so there's also, I would say, there's also a distinct shift in patterns of the slave trade from West Central Africa to Bahia, to the area by the Benin, to Bahia, the Mina coast to Bahia. So it's certainly I mean, we could also even kind of think out loud about patterns in sugar production and even diseases that are spreading in Brazil in the late 17th century as ways in which people are rethinking their world in new ways, the world around them and in captivity. So again, it's one of those things where a 2-page petition kind of opens a whole world of possibilities for trying to understand what's happening here. And I've really just skimmed the surface of it.
I'm just struck that there is a, I don't know if you want to call it faith maybe, but a confidence of appealing to law.
Yeah.
Because in North America, it's not so much. I mean, but especially by the 19th century. That's just interesting. I mean, it's a whole different cultural set of roots to this.
We had a question.
One more, maybe.
And
One.
I'm gonna congratulate myself on my ability to translate this from Spanish. Gonzalez sends greetings from Chile.
Hello.
And asks if you've made comparisons to Spanish, Latin America, these kinds of cases.
I haven't spent a lot of time doing that, but in the larger chapter of the book, I talk about this as a particular phenomenon within the Iberian empires as a way to think about the intelligibility between African systems and Iberian systems. And so I know that someone had mentioned Karen Graubart's work on the 1680s, also referenced Alejandro de la Fuente's work as well. So there's a lot of connections. Unfortunately, these histories have been less studied in the Brazilian context that they have in the Spanish American context. But if you have any suggestions, Lisa, I'm so clearly open to readings and cases that bring this up.
Well, we usually end by 1:15 here on the east coast of the United States. Not sure what time it is in Chile. And thank you again to our audience in-house and to all the people out online. Thank you all for coming. And John, we've had many scholars of Brazil and the Atlantic world trade to Brazil, but none more interesting than this. This is fascinating work. So good luck in your last week or two here.
Thank you.
I hope you find 17 more gems in the Beinecke that jump out at you. Thank everybody for coming. There's still a few cookies left. Great work.
Thank you.
Come back another time.